Hello students, and welcome to our transition video as we move from week 9, Visual Inquiry and History Alive, into week 10 and the focus on integrating literature and social studies in your classroom. And I'm not sure how well the lesson went. This is a lesson that works a lot better when you're in person and you can really have that experiential exercise of viewing the rocket launch and hearing it up close and personal and rearranging the room. A lot of the important elements of visual discovery are lost, at least somewhat, in this transition where we're working online. However, I do want to stress students are inundated every single day with imagery, with video, both online and in print. And it is so critical, it is so important that we help them develop their critical literacy skills. That really should be, I think, on the forefront of all teachers' minds, not just social studies, but for us specifically. As we're developing citizens in the United States, it's critically important that we help them develop critical thinking skills. We want to give them those opportunities to construct their knowledge based on their deconstruction of images. We want to give them those opportunities. We don't want to tell them. We want them to discover, uncover, and then make a claim and use evidence that they find in the images to support that claim. And so as you're thinking about ways to develop questions for students to answer using images that you find, I do encourage you to once more return to the Bloom's flipbook that I shared with you and take a look at the questioning prompts. A lot of times we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can modify these question stems to work as we use inquiry to understand and to dig into these images, to answer bigger questions, and to make claims based on what we're seeing in the images. We want to interact with the picture. We want the students to dig into it. We want them to observe the image and collect all the data they can based on what they're seeing. Observing, inferring, making a hypothesis, using the picture to support a claim that they're making to answer that compelling question. Again, it all stems from the concept to the question, and then you engage the material with the students and they develop the answer. You don't want to give them the answer. You want them to construct it based on what they're seeing. And as I suggested, you really want to give them a context. Give them roles. The easy one would be make them history detectives. Let the students become the detective and they're trying to solve a case. They have to investigate the evidence that they have, the images or maybe the video, and they have to come to an answer. They have to come to a conclusion. And that can be the assessment. The assessment is their ultimate presentation of their answer to the compelling question. In our example here in class, I had you become, in many ways, your students, but you were going to join the Space Shuttle Force, and I had you investigate and used images, and we talked about finding those high-resolution images and writing for understanding as we go, and thinking about the context, that role. The role really lends itself to what you can have the students do. So if they're detectives or they're members of the space, they're astronauts, what are they doing? And giving them that background context gives them a motivation to help them write for understanding. Thinking about other ways you can incorporate the images into the classroom, and this was part of the reading, you could have students step into images. And so, for example, they could step in. If you depicted this in the classroom, you could have a student step in, put their hand on their cheek in the same fashion, and express it. They could speak what they were thinking. Or perhaps you could have them step into the regalness of this painting and have them talk about their feelings and their emotions and what they want to express using their posture and the way they stand. And so having students stand in the images is another way. We call that act it outs. You can have students act out what they think is happening in the picture in the classroom. It makes it more organic, and it's a way to check their understanding. Are they getting it? Can they explain? Can they voice what's happening in the images that you're using? You can use images to study any of the strands: history, geography, civics, and economics. It's not just history. And it's not just geography. You can find images that represent all of the strands, especially if you're focusing on the concepts. Always go back to your concepts. What is it you're trying to have the students be able to explain? What is the perspective you want them to develop? What is it you want them to analyze and break down? Keep those concepts and those learnings close as you develop these ideas for your example lesson that you'll throw on your digital resume. And again, I want you to identify strand, concept, standard, 3 to 4 images, and then explain how that learning would take place. The digital resume doesn't need to have a collection of all, like everything doesn't need to be a full-blown lesson plan, but it should be an idea. It should be a representation of how you are seeing yourself use this material in the classroom. And then when we write for understanding, it's really important that we give them, again, characters to step into, perspectives that we want them to explain, and we want them to speak to views. We want them to identify and explain their reasoning in the moment for why something's happening or the action that they're taking. Too often, writing in the social studies is this: answer this essay question. Write a paragraph about this. That is devoid of context. If you truly want your students to learn and be able to show that learning, you want them to write in a context. You want them to write in the moment. And so I had you think about, like, what are the words you would write as you describe yourself blasting off into space? What would you write if you were standing there in the crowd for one inauguration or the other? You want to situate themselves in the moment. And that brings me to the question I asked you to really pay attention to the final activity they suggested in the Write for Understanding. Are there some situations that are off limits? Can we really have students write from the perspective of a slave? Is that appropriate? Does that fit within your view of what you're trying to do? Should you have students write from a slave master perspective? Can you write from a perspective that supports the Nazi regime or supports Hitler himself? There's always gatekeeping questions that we have to address as social studies teachers. These are the questions that you have to answer and understand before you engage in the classroom. This is why planning is so important. This is why scaffolding your questions ahead of time matters. You have to understand what it is you're helping they learn so that the lesson doesn't go off the rails. For example, I had a student teacher once do an activity in class where she had the students develop memes about World War II dictators. And the memes they created, they naturally, these high school students naturally went towards Hitler and Mussolini and the Holocaust, and they began to make fun of the Holocaust, and they began to make fun of the situation. That can be mitigated, that can be avoided with proper planning and consideration of what it is you're actually hoping they learn, which is why I ask you to write your objectives the way I do. My students will learn X by doing Y, and they will show that by Z. When we have them write for understanding, make them authentic writing opportunities. That's why I said, hey, let's have them write a Twitter post. Let's have them write a Facebook post if that's what they're still using. I think that's mainly old people these days. I know some of the examples in the reading were like dialogues and eulogies, having them make actual posters that you could hang up in the school. They can write their journals or their letters. Something for a newspaper, an online blog would be an example of this. Or poetry or songs. What comes natural to the students? That's where you want them to be able to express themselves in ways that make sense to them. If it's a talent they have, if it's something they already understand, you use that talent to build understanding in the social studies. That is really important and takes us all the way back to Lisa Delpit's comment and quote at the very beginning of class. Our students come from multiple worlds. They come from a home world, a peer world, and a school world, at least. They bring with them backgrounds, they bring with them talents, and we cannot look at the deficit. We may not maintain a deficit thinking view of our students. We must acknowledge, appreciate, celebrate, and most importantly, use the talents they bring into the classroom to strengthen the other information and skills and content that we're trying to help them learn. Okay, that brings us to next week, literature integration. As always, you have an overview. I really encourage you to pay attention to these. They can help you as you are writing your philosophy of education, answering our 5 questions. We've got our guiding questions and our learner outcomes. There is one reading about the use of trade books in the social studies classroom. Please make sure you do consider this. It will help you construct the final infographic. At the bottom here is your literature project, the assignment overview and purpose. We need to integrate books in a powerful fashion. The problem is this. Teachers say, oh yes, I'm teaching social studies. Look, I'm using a book about Abraham Lincoln or about Harriet Tubman. But all they do is have them read it. There's no focus on the content. It's only on can they read the book or not. And we must not allow the social studies content to be treated in such a way. Social studies is important, and it should be taught along with literature at the same time. You cannot have one only working for the other. And so your task is to create an infographic about 4 books, 1 book that you find for each strand, and then a concept, a compelling question, standards that it connects to, and an activity that you will use the book to do. So students will have an activity to complete. It cannot just be read the book. They have to read the book, and then there should be an activity that goes along with the book in class to dig further into the material they're reading about. So they're going to read this book. What are they going to do with this information? My students will read Yertle the Turtle in order to actively do something and then create something to show what they're learning. I then ask you to explain how that activity connects to the concepts, the standards, the compelling question, and the strand. And then I want you to reflect on how that book and lesson that you just described fits into your purpose of social studies education. How is this a representation of you in the classroom? I have a rubric for you to look at. This is how I will assess your submissions. I've given you a list of the trade books, and I think I give you all the way back to 2014. The NCSS puts out a list of these every year. So please take a look. There's some really good books on this list. I'll also post a couple more links to multicultural educational trade books as well. Now, where can you find these books? Well, you can look online. I'm not asking you to buy them. You can, but you might go to the library to find the books. And if you're wondering, like, I really want to use this book and I can't find it in the library, I want to read it, you can very often find read alouds. And read alouds are all over YouTube. Just search Yertle the Turtle Read Aloud, Rosa Read Aloud. These are some examples of people that have recorded themselves reading these books for students in the classroom. And we've seen a large jump in the number of read alouds that exist because of the current situation and the pandemic. And so I've got some examples for you to look at read alouds there. And then I also have an example of an infographic. So I have given you, well, these are the programs you can use. You can use Canva, Venngage, or Piktochart. Any of those work. Just figure out one that you think you're comfortable with. This is also for you to think about integrating technology into your classroom. How can we use infographics to allow our students to show knowledge, to express understanding, to tell us what they've learned? Infographics are good for that. This is where you submit it. At the bottom is my example. And so here is the example that I have provided you with. This has all the required information. Title of an amazing socialist trade book with the author and publication date. Tells me a little bit about what the book is and what it's supposed to be teaching us about. I've got my compelling question. I've got my concept and standards. I've got a video right here that you can play that will explain how it's all connected together. Here's where I've placed my activity idea, and at the bottom is my reflection. You can take a look at this and get a feel. It's just a mock-up. It's not super in-depth, but it gives you an idea of what I'm looking for. Everybody, email me with any questions. Have a great week.